Hello, comrades. Welcome back to the show. You know what they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same, and even with this nifty new style and a new place to live, I'm still late on deadlines, same as ever. But enough about my horrible ability to commit to goals, let's get on with it. The United States sure loves sticking their nose into other countries' affairs, don't they? A love so deep it goes back centuries. And we're going to be talking about just that. So, when I say the US has intervened in the affairs of nearly every single Central and South American nation in the last 50 years, give or take, shouldn't be surprised at all. After all, the US has a vested interest in keeping control over these territories. Can't have the people having any of that self-determination or democracy. That shit ain't good for business. Alright, so the standard operating procedure normally goes like this. US notices that the insert name of country here has begun to become just a tad too socialistic for their liking, or they begin nationalizing a resource US businesses happen to be using. So begins the spread of lies about the nation and its leaders. Such and such is a dictator, the people have no food, such and such murders dissidents, yada yada yada. We've heard it a million times at this point. Mind you, none of these are ever true, right? It doesn't stop corporate media and, libs spreading lies about this like it's going out of style. Then, after this goes on for a bit, the US will begin attempting a coup. The US will begin its normal narrative, right? People want democracy, all while supporting terrorists and fascists in the nation by giving it arms, training, and funds. Now, normally, at this point, most of the US population has bought the BS. They think insert name of country here is a despotic dictatorship bent on ruining the lives of its citizens and begin uncritically supporting the quote-unquote protesters who are now either fighting in the streets with the legal government or are striking and cutting off essential services. At this point, it can go a few ways. Best case scenario is the coup attempt fails, in which case the US public quickly forgets the whole thing, and the US just tries again in a few years. If the US doesn't decide to try again later, they might try to just straight up invade the country in the name of building democracy, and then proceed to install a fascist puppet. Worst case, the coup succeeds. Leaders of the native communities are murdered or forced to leave their homes, the police and military seize the nation, and oh look! A fascist puppet. And nearly every single intervention ends up this way. The US and its corporations just cannot afford to have their sources of cheap materials nationalized and the labor actually paid for. That would hurt the bottom line. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, we see the US do these tactics all over the world. Hell, Middle East is pretty topical right now because of this very thing. And I would respond to that by saying, yes, exactly. It's exactly what the US does. Maybe we'll talk about the Middle East later, especially considering current events. But right now, we're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere a bit. Now, this part's going to get a little long, right? But let's go ahead and go down the list of each US-led coup and or invasions within Central and South America. In 1846, the US invades Mexico, stealing over half their territory, which ended up being most of the western US, and mind you, that was already stolen by the Spanish from the natives. So, great start all around. 1903, the engineering of a coup in Colombia that creates the borderline puppet state of Panama, so the US can build the Panama Canal using the locals as low-wage labor, or, in a lot of cases, slave labor. Straight out. 1903, again, by the way, the US signs a treaty, quote, heavy, air quotes there, basically making Cuba a puppet state and creating Guantanamo Bay. 1914, the US invades the Mexican port of Veracruz to stop the revolution going on in Mexico at the time from going the, quote, wrong way. Alright, quick disclaimer. There are a lot of names that I can't pronounce. I'm sorry. Make fun of me for it later. Just kind of deal. Alright, let's go. 1954, goodbye Jacobo Arbenz, legal and democratically elected president of Guatemala. The CIA didn't like you, so who had to go? Oh, also the US bombed your people and led an invasion along with that coup, so that's nice. 1961, the Bay of Pigs. This failed. Didn't stop the CIA, though, from trying to have Castro assassinated literally a few hundred times. All of which also failed. 1964. Remember Guatemala, what I said about them? Yeah, now Brazil's João Goulart also goes on his merry way, in exchange for a dictatorship that'll last until the 80s. 1965, the U.S. invades the Dominican Republic to intervene in a civil war. 1973, first comes Guatemala, then Brazil, now Chile's own democratically elected Salvador Allende is ousted in a CIA-backed coup. He is replaced by a guy, not sure if you've heard of him, he's kind of out there, and Augusto Pinochet. You know, the dictator that slaughtered thousands and imprisons tens of thousands more. The guy who, with the help of a US-guided program of privatization and deregulation, invented what we know today as neoliberalism. That guy. The US did that. Moving on to 1989, the US just invaded the Caribbean island of Grenada for what the US claimed was siding with Cuba. 1989, again, US had to reinvade Panama. They were cleaning up a mess they made with a rogue CIA agent turned dictator. 1991, a coup that may or may not have been assisted by some CIA training, oust democratically elected president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Artiste. This one's on the list mostly for coverage's sake. There's not a whole lot of evidence that's permeable to make this proven that the US did it advertently. It's really complicated situation, honestly. I may have to do another video on this one in particular in the future. 1994, US invades the island of Haiti to remove the government they had installed via coup in 1991 that had ousted the last president. This invasion reinstates Artiste. 2002, failed US-backed coup of Venezuela. Hugo Chavez loses power for like 2 days and then comes back. 2004, remember Haiti and how I said it was a super complicated situation? Yep, another US-backed coup, ousted the guy they brought back into power. Again. 2009, US supports a military coup in Honduras. President Manuel Zelaya is booted from office and replaced. All throughout the 70s in Argentina, Chile, and other US-backed puppets and allies, the governments of those nations worked with the US in a US-led Operation Condor. It was a huge, brutal retaliation against leftists and Marxists of all kinds throughout the region. And all throughout the 80s, the Reagan administration backed a bunch of anti-communist Contra forces in Nicaragua against the Sandinista government. They also backed the El Salvadorian government against the FMLN rebels, FMLN being an organization of leftist rebels. And then, of course, on top of all of it, you have the more modern 2019 stuff with Chile, Venezuela, and Bolivia. Honestly, I wanted this to be a way more comprehensive list, but the US has done so much just to destabilize this region that it's really hard to keep track of everything. I most likely missed some things, and if it wasn't for my comrades over at the People's World writing an absolutely beautiful article almost a year back, links in the thing with my other sources, I'd have been lost in this haze a lot longer than I already was, so thanks for that. Each of the states on this list, while I described the events in an arguably humorous way, as I possibly could for entertainment's sake, they went through situations someone like me, as someone who lives arguably pretty comfy in the Imperial core, would completely collapse at. The rapes, the murders, the destructions of friend, family, and property, all on scales that would make the devil himself weep. The United States did this for her corporations to score some uncontended resources and labor. When the US finally does admit to its actions, whether by some arbitrary date set in the future for declassification or by leaks, the excuses they make are always the same. The leaders are oppressing their people. As the leader of the free world, it's our duty to help these poor people find democracy. They have no food. Here, take our food aid. No strings attached, I promise. It's never about installing democracy. It's never about the people of the region at all. It's for a few rich capitalists to sit even prettier when the US market gets a bit too small for their liking. The absolute horror of what the US has done is hard to describe from my arguably limited point of view. So I have with me today a very patient comrade, one who has waited all of these weeks for me to get to this part of the script, so that way they can segue in nicely. A comrade with family ties to Guatemala. Comrade ElCanalDelPueblo. I really hope I said that right.
Hey, what's good, bro? So yes, the United States has an absolutely terrible history of sponsored coups for both economic dominance and stabbing out socialism in Latin America. One of those stories is extremely personal to me and my family, and when compared to a lot of the modern day coups, such as in Venezuela and Bolivia, it actually tells a pretty interesting story that the United States government and its corporate overlords basically use the same exact strategy every single time, as my friend here, non-applicable, has already previously mentioned. So my family comes from Guatemala and left fairly recently. The first ones to immigrate did so in the late 1990s, and the last ones in the early 2000s. So they were around in Guatemala to experience Guatemala's fairly brief period of socialism, also known as the Guatemalan Revolution. This all started with an actual revolution in 1944 against the US-sponsored Juan Federico Ponce Baides, who was, fun fact, preceded by Jorge Huico Castañeda, who was also sponsored by the United States, continued his predecessor's policies of giving massive concessions to the United Fruit Company and the wealthy landowners from both the United States and the Criollo bourgeoisie that had been their Spaniards were, as well as supporting their harsh labor practices and dead-ass admired Napoleon and Hitler. Eventually, the Guatemalan people simply had enough, with even the moderately rich middle class pitching in to lead much of the revolt. Now, after Ponce Baides was removed, a leader called Juan José Arevalo Bermejo was elected in 1945 and led the country until 1948. His ideology was one that he called socialismo espiritual, or spiritual socialism in English, which is pretty similar to Sandinismo, and that is very pan-Latin Americanist, very nationalistic towards some nation, while at the same time being very economically socialist. Arevalo did a complete overhaul of the Guatemalan economy. For example, foreign estates that were criminally underdeveloped for any type of agricultural business were confiscated and redistributed to the peasants of those lands. Landowners were forced to provide better housing for their workers, new public schools, hospitals, and houses were built, and a new minimum wage was introduced, which helped a lot to reduce poverty in Guatemala. In Guatemala's urban areas, newly constructed labor unions accompanied reformist labor laws that greatly benefited the lower and middle classes of the cities. Several parties and trade unions were also formed. The new enfranchisement of a previously extremely disenfranchised portion of the population was one of, if not the most remembered ideological part of Arevalo's presidency. The benefits, however, did not go to the rural agrarian areas. However, whereas Sindalo traditions, termed latifundia, remained patrician, racist, unyielding, and pretty fucking harsh, I'd say. While the government made efforts to improve the civil rights of the campesinos, rural conditions in Guatemala could not be improved without large-scale reform proposals mediated fairly compensated land redistribution. Failure in achieving that was a weakness for Arevalo's party in Congress and thus for his administration, which his successor attempted to confront and to remedy with Decree 900, which I will talk about more in depth later. Something quite interesting to note, however, is that while he was very clearly economically socialist, he was not a communist. He opposed the idea of the end goal of communism stated by anarcho-communists and Marxist-Leninists, stating that a completely classless and moneyless society is antithetical to human nature, and saw a democratic market socialist society such as the one seen in Yugoslavia as the end goal. He wanted to keep that specific system, which I disagree with, but I can get behind to a certain extent. He actively silenced communist movements to try and get into the good eyes of the United States and the more powerful capitalist parts of Latin America, which I do not agree with. But despite of that, the United States-backed portions of the Guatemalan military tried to oust him from power about 25 to 30 times for supposedly colluding with communists while actively silencing communists, mind you. He survived those coups and was replaced by Arbenz in the 1950 election. Now, Arbenz was pretty much Arevalo, but on steroids, you feel me? Instead of Arevalo's rather abstract concept of spiritual socialism, he went full-on communist, getting endorsements from the majority of Guatemala's communist parties. His reforms were basically the same as Arevalo's, but much more intense. The biggest portion of Arbenz's project of modernization was his agrarian reform bill. Arbenz drafted the bill himself with the help of a few other advisors that included some leaders of the Communist Party and a few non-communist economists. It transferred uncultivated land from large landowners to their poverty-stricken laborers, who would then be able to begin a viable farm of their own. Arbenz also had hella motivation to pass the bill because he needed to generate capital for his infrastructure projects within the country. The official title of the bill was Decree 900, as I've already said. It took land from holdings that were larger than 673 acres. The owners were compensated with government bonds equal to the land expropriated, which I don't agree with at all. In my opinion, they shouldn't have been paid a dime, but I suppose if you look at foreign PR, that is what needed to be done. Fun fact, Arbenz, who was a landowner prior to his presidency, even gave up most of his own land with this, which I hella respect. The law resulted in an increase of Guatemalan agricultural productivity and cultivated area. Purchases of agricultural machinery also increased. Overall, the law resulted in a significant improvement in living standards for many thousands of poor-ass families, the majority of which were indigenous people. But the most apparent part of the Arbenz presidency was arguably the relationship between Guatemala and the United Fruit Company. The relationship between Arbenz and the United Fruit Company was a massive turning point in U.S. dominance in Central America and Latin America in general. The United Fruit Company had extremely large holdings of land and railroads across Central America, which it used to support its banana business. By 1930, it had been the largest landowner and employer in Guatemala for several years. And I want to rephrase that for y'all. A foreign company held the majority of the employment and land in Guatemala. The majority of that money went directly to the United States. So Guatemala was understandably broke as fuck before Arevalo and Arbenz came along. UICO asked the company to pay its workers only about 50 cents a day to prevent other workers' unions from demanding higher wages. They also pretty much owned Puerto Barrios, which is Guatemala's only port to the Atlantic Ocean. By 1950, the company's annual profits were about 65 million US dollars, which is deadass twice the revenue of the Guatemalan government itself at that time. Now, because of this ridiculously powerful position in Guatemala, the reforms of the governments of Arbenz and Arevalo affected the United Fruit Company more than most other companies, which led to a popular perception that the United Fruit Company itself was being targeted, which, if I'm finna be honest, it probably was, but its ridiculously powerful position for being a foreign company in Guatemala made that perfectly understandable. The United Fruit Company responded with a massive lobbying campaign against Arbenz in the United States, which we can also see in the modern-day coups. Not only in leftist Latin American countries such as in Argentina, Bolivia, and Venezuela, but in leftist and simply anti-US imperialism third world countries all across the world, such as in Iran and Syria. Iran and Syria obviously aren't socialist in the slightest, but they are extremely vocal about their anti-imperialism. That alone makes them a target for a massive smear operation by the United States. Now, the smears against Arbenz were pretty typical, that Guatemala was no longer democratic, that the elections were rigged, that there was no longer any economic freedom in Guatemala, which was obviously extremely untrue, etc. The Guatemalan government responded by saying that the company was the main obstacle to progress in the country, which it very clearly was. To the Guatemalans, it seemed like their country was being exploited by foreign interests, which took huge profits without making any contributions to the well-being of the nation, which was pretty undeniably true. In 1953, 200,000 acres of uncultivated land was confiscated under Arbenz's Agrarian Reform Bill, and the company was offered compensation at the rate of $3 per acre of land, twice what it had paid buying the company. Twice! These people shouldn't have been paid a dime for the practical theft they imposed on Guatemala, yet they were compensated with twice what the land was originally bought for. But anyways, this resulted in further lobbying in Washington, particularly through Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who had dangerously close ties to the company. The company had begun a public relations campaign to discredit the Guatemalan government, spending over $500,000 to influence both lawmakers and members of the public in the United States that the Guatemalan government of Jacobo Arbenz needed to be taken out. And so, here the coup started. The CIA operation to overthrow Jacobo Arbenz, codenamed Operation PB Success, was given the green light by Eisenhower in 1953, around August. The plans included writing lists of people in Arbenz's government to be assassinated if the coup were to be carried out. The State Department created a team of diplomats who would support PB Success. The CIA relied heavily on the Guatemalan exile groups and their anti-democratic allies in Guatemala. The CIA considered several candidates to lead the coup, first thinking that Miguel Ydigoras Fuentes, the conservative candidate, who had lost the 1950 election to Arbenz, would do the trick, but his role in the UICO regime, as well as his European appearance, made him hella unlikely to appeal to the majority mixed-race mestizo population. They eventually settled on Castillo Armas, in exile since the failed 1949 coup, and on the CIA's payroll since 1951. A series of rapid aerial and ground attacks quickly dispatched government and civilian forces racing in to protect the government. Some 120 adamant loyalists or communists were allowed to leave, and the CIA stated that none of the assassination plans contemplated by the CIA were actually implemented, but later Guatemalan and American historians find that pretty doubtful. In May 1997, the CIA pretty much said that it had rediscovered some of the documents that it said were lost, but the names of the assassination targets had all been redacted, which made it impossible to verify whether any of the people on the CIA assassination list were actually killed as part of the op. It's sad, really, and it truly helps understand the reasoning for the large anti-U.S. sentiment in Guatemala and much of Central America. Just when their country was doing good, and its economic progress was helping the previous poor out of their aforementioned poverty, the United States had to come along and pretty much fuck everything over. And all of this information is extremely important when studying both historical and modern day coups, because this process is extremely efficient and bad in general for the people of third world countries. It is also useful for our cause in ways that the CIA and its corporate backers don't really seem to understand. See, now we can fairly accurately predict a coup attempt. We can see their bullshit from a mile away because they've done this so many times. We know the shit they pulling out. Everyone saw the Bolivia coup from a mile away, and even though we couldn't stop it, we knew exactly what was happening. Nationalization or collectivization of some major industry that the American or European companies were making hella bank off of, followed by a smear campaign in the U.S. media, followed by a pro-democracy movement, which, if the U.S. gets its way, leads to an overthrow of whatever government was opposing the United States. So, when the U.S. media starts smearing the living shit out of some third world anti-imperialist nation, think twice about believing what they say. If you can, take a vacation to that country and talk with the locals about what they think. Hell, talk with some of the immigrants from that area. The internet too, but people's opinions on the internet don't always show what the majority of the people actually agree on. There are a lot of extremely vocal minority groups on the internet, especially on YouTube and Twitter. And something tells me that what the people of that country say won't be the same story as what the capitalist media brings out.
Comrade, thank you so much for your assistance and insight here. I definitely hope we can work together again soon. It was a blast, absolutely amazing. Everyone go ahead and show them some love down below. I put their Twitter and YouTube channel. Go ahead and say hi for me. And with that, my friends, we can finally answer the question brought up in the title of this video. Why can't Latin America catch a break? Simple. The US won't let them. They never have, and so long as the US keeps on this path, they never will. The efforts of our comrades in the South are always threatened. They need our solidarity. We should, as principled communists, offer our uncritical support of the socialism they can eke out for themselves in the face of imperialism. We should be offering them solidarity in their struggles and supporting their dreams of a brighter future for all of humanity. If you live in the imperial core, join a communist party. Organize your communities, teach yourself and the people around you revolutionary ideas and praxis, form secondary power structures, and set up your spaces in such ways that would further the goal of revolution. For our comrades abroad to feel safe in their gains and successes, and for them to not have to worry about the atrocities from opportunistic imperialist powers, they should not have to act alone in their defense. We should work hard building a West that will not immediately attack those gains. Nothing is pointless or too hard. We have the revolutionary spirit of the workers at our side. Believe in your fellow workers and in the revolution. Comrades, I truly hope you found today's episode useful one way or another. I am very grateful that you listened all the way to the end here. I am hoping that I'll be able to start producing content more regularly now that the move is finished and next semester's schoolwork is all set up and ready to go. But until the next episode, have a great day. Bye.